All right, everybody. I want to get into World War II and its 5 main ideas. The point of this little mini lesson is I want to discuss some of these things with you. I want you to be thinking, taking notes. I want you to be thinking critically. And a part of the hyperdoc is that you can come back to this at any time. So you're going to do a little bit of work with it now. You're going to answer some questions on the hyperdoc. But ultimately, the goal is that you've got this as a resource all unit. When we talk about World War II, we want to think of 5 main ideas. And the reason for those 5 main ideas is that we've studied the war before. We've seen the History Channel. We've seen the movies. We love how big World War II is. There's so many different things you can learn about. And with war movies, we typically think of the battlefield. Well, I want you to be aware of something here, that the battlefield is really only part of the story. There's so much more going on. It's a total war. It's going to include millions of people. Tons and tons of people are going to die. Tons and tons of things are going to be destroyed. It's going to reshape the world, and it's going to reshape really America's role in the world after the war. So the 5 main ideas are, first of all, the causes. Most of this hyperdoc is focused on the causes. So when you think about the rise of dictators in Europe and in Japan, when you think about economic hardship, Nazism, communism, nationalism, those are those big things in terms of causes of the war. So when we look at the causes, you want to be able to be aware of the different things that are going to lead to the war and how it's going to apply to really both America's role in the war, which is really our focus, but also how the war takes shape and then ultimately how the war ends. When we talk about the home front, when you think of the word front, in this context, we're thinking about where the war is taking place. So there's the Eastern Front or the Western Front in the war in Europe, or there's the battle front, if you want to think of it that way. The front lines. Well, the home front is how the war is being fought at home. This is where men and women in America, black, white, rich, poor, cities, rural, it doesn't matter. This is where they're waging the war on Nazism and the Japanese. This is where people are sacrificing food. Maybe they're not eating as much. We have things like wheatless days and meatless days. This is where Rosie the Riveter and women joining the workforce comes in. This is where African Americans joining the workforce as a kind of a second part of the Great Migration is taking place. The home front is how the war is being fought at home. What are American civilians, American citizens doing at home to support the war effort in Europe and in the Pacific? Our third main idea is the war in Europe. So this is, we're talking about Hitler and Mussolini. This is, we're talking about Germany, Italy. Later on, after the war, we don't like Russia. But during the war, we are allies with Russia, with Britain, France, and Russia. That makes up our main part of our alliance. So we want to think about, how is the war being fought in Europe? What is Hitler doing? What is Mussolini doing? What's the Soviet Union doing? We're not really going to focus on the battles all the time, but I do want you to understand those concepts of blitzkrieg, the style of fighting. I want you to think of firebombing. I want you to think of the way the war is being fought in Europe. It is very different than World War I. World War I, we had trench warfare where we sat there and killed each other, right? And it was just onslaught and very little land was taken. Europe, especially, is going to benefit from the advent of the tank and mechanized warfare, including airplanes. Because now, instead of just lining up across and shooting each other, you could drive tanks at each other, you could bomb each other from long distances, and you didn't need the trenches. Another thing here we're going to look at is North Africa. Even though Africa is a different continent, it's considered part of the European theater. So when we learn about the war in Europe, we're also learning about the war in North Africa. When we talk about the Pacific theater, we have a completely different war. It's a completely different style of fighting. After the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, we're going to go into war with both Japan and the Nazis, but the Nazis and Italy in Europe. So we have a two-front war. We're fighting in the Pacific Ocean and we're fighting in Europe, in North Africa. In the Pacific theater, it's completely different though. It's jungles and it's islands. So the thing you have to really understand is that it's our Navy and what becomes the Air Force, but at this time is called the Army Air Corps. It's the Navy and the Army Air Corps bombing islands, naval battles, out in the middle of the ocean, Guadalcanal, Midway, and so on. It's taking island after island after island in a strategy called island hopping. The Japanese had this huge empire, but it was all separated by water, so it's very hard to defend. So as we move through the Pacific theater, we're going to take these islands, we're going to have these major naval battles, and ultimately, in August of 1945, so after 4 years almost, a short 4 years, because Pearl Harbor is in December 1941, but in August of 1945 was when we're finally going to use the atomic bomb. on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later on Nagasaki. So the Pacific Theater is almost a completely different war. It ends at a different time, it's fought in a different way, so it's important to know the distinctions between those two things. And then finally is the legacy of World War II. World War II is going to change the role of the United States in the world. It's going to create the Cold War. It's going to set the US and the Soviet Union as the two world powers. It's going to set up that kind of contest and conflict between democracy and communism. The legacy of World War II really plays into the United States today. It remains that Britain and France are close allies, although Germany has also become an ally of the United States, a very strong ally. It remains that we're afraid or have tension with Russia, which is what's left of the Soviet Union. And honestly, the role of the United States as kind of this military power, this protector of other nations remains. So that legacy of World War II is really complicated and complex. In fact, the people who lived during this time period are often called the greatest generation. And so as we compare that with our generation, well, I'm too old, I guess, your generation, we really kind of put those things in conflict with each other. And so what is the legacy of these people who survived the Great Depression, who survived World War II, who stopped evil in the form of Nazism in its tracks, and like I said, completely changed world history? That's where we're going this unit. I'm here to help, I'm here to support. So if there's anything I can do, as we learn in this unit, always email me, but these are the 5 things that you really want to spend your time focusing on. And honestly, if you're thinking about short answer test questions coming up, seems like we got 5 pretty good question topics. All right, take care.